Oh yeah, let me grab that.
Oh, we're offline.
Offline?
Oh no, wait. Nope, we're good. We are good.
Last slide just now.
We're good. Let's check it.
Okay, give it a second.
Load. Please and thank you.
There you go. Yep. Good. Wait, Don?
Hello, what's up?
Oh, the delay's actually like 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
Yeah. I got it right here.
It's good now?
Good audio.
Alright, cool. Events. Alright, please scan the QR code. Okay, cool. So today we're going to do kind of an introduction for like Linux hardening in general. And the reason why this is one of the most important topics to learn, and blue teaming specifically, is for 2 reasons. If you want to be a SOC analyst, you have to be able to detect like misconfigurations being abused, or if you just want to be, even red teaming, you have to understand what a misconfiguration is or a vulnerability for a service to exactly just target it. So the things we're kind of going to be covering is just really 2 things, common vulnerabilities and misconfigurations with Linux in general, specifically like services, for example, SSH. And we're also going to be doing some hands-on practice if my scripts work properly. So does everyone have their Ubuntu VM open? Not the Graylog one though.
Same one.
Same one, it shouldn't matter. I would prefer not to using the Graylog one because we got that working and we are planning to use that a little bit later for some more like simulation stuff. But for today, it doesn't really matter. Alright, cool. So this might be a little bit of a review for people and a little bit of more of an introduction for some people. So for Linux, everything is basically known as a file, and I put that in quotes. And like these files can represent like the hardware you have on your machine, the file descriptors, which are basically, what type of permissions are allowed in files that are open for certain like services and scripts that you're running. For example, if you're using a Python script and opening like a text file, you can see that with the files descriptor. And then any normal files that you're typically used to, config file, txts, pictures, anything like that. It's pretty normal. And if you guys want to just like go to your terminal for your VM, gotta log back in. We're just going to go a quick rundown through some stuff. Because raise your hand if you're very familiar with the command line. And raise your hand if you know the Linux file structure. Alright, so about like 50-50-ish. Alright, cool. So this is a good overview. So let me make this bigger. So when you open up your terminal, you're greeted with just your home directory. And just to show you guys that is, we're just going to use the pwd command, print working directory. And you can see I'm in /home, my user. And this is pretty normal because /home is like usually the home for all your users. And this is also one of the areas that can hold many misconfigurations. Because for example, if I use ls and list all files, even the hidden ones, we have a certain folder called .ssh. And we can access that folder. And I could show you guys the contents of it. And currently I have nothing in it because this is a fresh VM. Some of you guys might have stuff in it if you've currently like SSH to other devices before. And basically this holds like your configuration for a few of your SSH things. So for example, like if you have authorized hosts, like you SSH to this one box, it creates like a fingerprint and saves it on both machines. So like, oh, this is valid. Like this is not some random bot accessing. But this also can store your SSH keys. And your keys are basically like the bread and butter for good security, but it can be really bad at the same time as well. Because for example, let's say you have your private key that you generated, and your private key is basically like the key to your house. You don't want anyone else to have it. And if they do have it, someone can just mimic you. They can take you, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically use your own credentials to basically mimic what you are to like the machine. So for example, you're some developer, your permissions are screwed up on your home directory, some other user on the same machine accesses your .ssh folder and sees, oh, I can actually read it. And they can abuse that private key and basically become you, which is one way of privilege escalation.
Wait,
So
can you explain how those keys are used?
So the keys are used in a few different ways. For example, typical SSH uses just like password authentication. But when you want another layer of security, you could use key, like a key pair. So basically you have a public key which you can give to anyone or any trusted machine. And then you got your private key which is just for yourself that you give to no one. And those keys basically are saying, hey, I'm using my public key to reach out to you, and you already know me, so let's connect. And that's basically how you can connect to remote computers and stuff. Pretty normal, like such as that for SSH specifically. And the way you can go further with this is if we go to the root directory cd/, and we can see we got etc or etc, however you want to pronounce it. Really depends on you. We can go to that directory. And this is the directory that usually holds all the configurations for like a lot of the services on your machine. So like I could do, l/la, and it's going to show a lot because it covers basically every service, every like I guess like your networking, like even like a database running in the background, anything really. But the reason why this is really important is we're going to access a folder within this directory called ssh, or not a slash, just ssh. Oh my god, there's a delay. Yeah. So you want to do cd/etc/ssh. You can also show the contents of this folder now. And we can see I have one called, whoops. Oh my lord. This VM is sluggish today. But I'm going to use sudo so I can access the file because as you can see with like the read permissions right here, it is just owned by root, and we only have read access and read access, but I do want to write to it, so I'm going to need to do sudo with it, and then ssh config, and then use your sudo password. Now this is one of the configuration files that's very important, not nearly as important as the sshd_config one. This one is specifically for the client of SSH, because we're used to connecting to SSH servers, which are pretty common. For example, like if you've done Hack the Box or Try Hack Me, a lot of those boxes have an SSH like service running on them already. And the way you access that is through this configuration, which is your client. So the way your client config is set up is it basically sets the parameters for how you want to connect to the server. And this can be used in many different ways. For example, like we got password authentication, yes, that's typically really good. And we see our identity files right here. So remember how I was talking about the .ssh directory? And if you guys don't know what the tilde, the squiggly line, however you want to say it, that just represents your own home directory as your person. So whoever you're signed in as, if you have a home directory like established, that's just your tilde. You can do cd tilde right now if you want. It'll bring you back to your home directory. But you can see we got the ID RSA and like the ID DSA. Those are those keys I was talking about earlier. For this VM, I don't have them created, but many of your machines might already have it already. And these are the specific files themselves that you could yoink from a machine and then, become them if they have not secured it properly. Who else has, within the directory, do any of you have an SSHD file? Okay. So I want you to open it up with sudo nano. And I will pull an example one real quick. Let me just enable SSH for my. I gotta enable the server for this VM real quick. Just double checking. Yeah, that's it. So for anyone else who does not have that configuration, I'll just walk you through it real quick. You just want to do. Oh God, let me just fix that. You just want to do sudo apt update to update your repositories, especially if you haven't touched the VM for a while. It's really good to do this. And then you just want to install your OpenSSH server. Oh my god, my VM is chugging today. So now after you, is anyone still installing it? Or everyone good? We're good? All right, cool. So then now if you just want to verify that it's actually running, you can use systemctl and do status on SSH itself. And you can see it says active and running for me for the SSH service. That sounds good. And then, yeah, it should be good. So now if I go back to this directory, my SSH directory, and go here, I got a lot more in this folder. So for example, the one that we really care about is this sshd_config. So we have to use sudo nano for it again. Oh my lord. And this is the most important config when you're securing like a machine. And this is like the first place you really want to check when you're during a competition, is to see what settings they have set up for their like their server. So for example, port 22, that's like the default port for like SSH like in general. And let's say, you know, I'm sure you guys have heard about you know, changing your known ports to like more obscure ones, because you got the saying obscurity through security. So for example, like for normal like events, if you're running a like SSH server at your house that connects from wherever you are, you don't want to have it on the default port, because if you check your authentication logs right now, there's bots constantly trying to brute force your password. And that's if you're like external right now. But the two ones we're going to really look at today are really simple ones, but they mean a lot. So, what's up? Okay, I'll show you. It was open sudo apt install open ssh-server, and then it should be running after you install it. So I'm going to go back to the configuration, and there's two parts we really want to care about. So this one's already commented out because it's like the you know, the hashtag, or you know, however you want to say it. So usually for competition machines, they say permit root login yes. And can anyone tell me why this is a horrible thing to have on your SSH server?
Because someone can SSH in as root, do a lot of damage.
Exactly. So with just this line alone, this is one of the most lines that's uncommented during your competitions, and just for like certain new machines as well. They will allow you to use the root user to log in with SSH. And the reason why that's bad is for a magnitude of reasons. So for example, if your root password is just not secure and just has, you know, like, you know, just 2 words or something very common that could be in a, you know, password list, some bot could just, you know, brute force your root password and get in, and then immediately install like a rootkit, all sorts of nasty stuff. So always you should uncomment that line and change yes to no. And the other thing you should really worry about is, it might not be commented out for me, but should be password authentication. Let me find it. I don't seem to see it. But as you can see, we also have a pub key authentication, is what we mentioned about earlier, about using a public key to connect to a server. And that's something you want to say yes for, but we're not going to comment that out right now because we have not like made a key pair for this machine. So only really worry about the permit root login for no. That will definitely say yes on competitions. I've seen it many times, and that's the first place to look. So after you say no to that, and you know, whatever text editor you are, you can exit out now. That change does not apply to your service yet. So you have to use sudo, you have to reload SSH itself. I think it's reload. Oh. Please stop lagging. So you can use sudo systemctl reload SSH. This will just restart the service basically for you and apply that configuration. Is everyone following along? Cool, cool. Anyone need more time?
Is there a question, or not a question, a command to reload like multiple services? Like sudo systemctl reload and then like everything?
Oh,
If you were hardening, like I assume you just want to use one command instead of reloading everything, right?
well, if you reload everything, that can shut off. Like, okay, so for example, if you're remoting into a machine and you reload everything, that's going to reload like the network connection and sever you. So you have to reconnect. And during competitions, that extra like 30 seconds to a minute of everything restarting, especially when you're doing everything, there could be just something that you missed and you just don't want to immediately do it. It's best to just do it kind of like as a tier system. So you kind of go for like your SSH service first, secure that, because a weak SSH means like immediate shell access for an attacker. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, you can do status for systemctl as well. This systemctl in general is basically like the orchestrator for all your services for Ubuntu specifically. But we're not going to get into that because that's kind of it's a big mess, honestly. So we're just going to clear. And okay. Would you guys like to go into a little bit more of the networking securing? Or would you want to do a little bit like files and permissions? Networking? Okay, cool. So I'm using Terminator, which allows me to show both panes for you guys. And I'm going to show you something that is shown pretty often. So you guys use Netcat and stuff already for CTF meetings and some of the BlueTeam meetings as well. So when you immediately get on a box, the first thing you probably should check for, as well as securing your SSH, is to see if there's a shell actually running that's remotely. Like that's not supposed to be there, not even through SSH, could be through Netcat. And just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to use Netcat myself and just spawn a listener. Oh, whoops. And I just use Netcat, and I use the arguments of -L, V, and P. Make sure P is the very last one because that specifies your port. And I just made it on port 4000 just for this test scenario. So now with my other like terminal, I'm going to see if I have a shell here, or at least in a listener, because, you know, on either type of machines that you're like on, they could either be listening for some sort of service to like send some commands, or it could already be an established connection. So in this case, it's just going to be listening. So if I do something called Netstat and use the arguments of TULPN, this will show like listening processes and like the numeric value associated with them. So when I run this, oh, I have to install it. So since we already did sudo apt update, when I do sudo apt install net tools, I'm surprised this does not come with Ubuntu anymore.
I think it's because they want you to use like IPA and the other instead of like IPA.
Does IPA actually show your established connections?
It can do that. Not A, but other stuff.
Okay.
If they could install IPA.
Did everyone install your Netstat? Does anyone need to see the command again?
Yes,
Oh, you need to see it?
Yeah.
Sudo apt install net-tools. All right, cool. So now we're going to run Netstat with these arguments, TULPN. This will give us a nice clean output for what services are running on what ports and if they're local or external to this device itself. So when I open this up and make this bigger, you can see we got some normal ones. We got, you know, SSH listening on 0000, which means our SSH server is running externally. That means anyone in our current network with this VM can reach out to my SSH. And you can see right there by the state it's on. And we can see something on the program name section called, you know, it has a number and it says Netcat, NC.
I don't have that.
Did you start the Netcat listener? PID,
Oh, yeah.
process
So-
identifier.
So a quick thing about the netcat listener, make sure P is the last argument that you
Yes.
have. Because right after P, you need to have the port number, because P stands for port. So in his case, he had LVPN,
Yeah.
and then 4000, and it's like, oh, I don't know what N is. N is not a number. So make sure P is the last variable or whatever in that little bunch of letters. So that way the port exists.
Does that everyone have Netcat running in like a separate terminal or separate window?
Yeah. Point
Yeah.
out to that.
It could be the same port as mine. As long as it's like over like 2000, you should be fine. It won't yell at you. Over 1000. So if we go back to our Netstat, you can see that program name right there, Netcat. And it's listening on port 4000, and it's all IP addresses. Yes.
Why can you see the program netcat, but you can't see SSH or DNS or the other things running?
It's most likely off the permissions, because I'm in Netstat right now, and I just ran it as my own user. If I actually run Netstat with sudo, you should be able to see a lot more identifiers. And you can see right there, SSHD.
Because the user that ran it was root.
Correct. Does anyone have any questions about that?
So you can only see as much as your user's permissions allow you to see. And
Yes.
since netcat was run as which user?
Netcat was run as our user in
Yeah,
this
that's
case.
why you
That's why it popped up on the PID and the program name itself. But depending on like what machines you're on, you might not have sudo access or you might have admin access. It really just depends on the scenario. You just kind of have to like tread through what permissions you currently have and see if you can like increase them in any way.
Usually while doing system hardening, you're likely root. So it's easier to run things as the root user, but also more dangerous. So things like Netstat always run with sudo, so you can see it's easier. A lot of times a netcat backdoor is probably as root, so you won't be able to tell what it is. You know what I mean? So run things as sudo, generally.
Correct. So now, for example, if we're just in this one terminal right now, we don't even see the netcat running. We just know it's there because of Netstat. If we want to just kill that, we can see right here we got a process identifier. So you could just use the kill command and the process ID. Oh, my numpad's not on. And then when we run sudo netcat again, we could just do up arrow, then rerun the last command. And if you see now, I have nothing listening on port 4000. We killed that connection. And if I go to my other shell, you can see right here it just says terminated. And this can be the same thing for any type of basically like a reverse shell. Even though this was just listening, this could have been an established connection. And just to show and like an established connection, I will do that real quick. So we're going to use the netcat command again on one pane, and then we're going to connect to it locally. And you can see the connection received right here. So anything I type over here is basically just like a chat window. You know, ls, you know, I'm trying commands, but they're not running because there's no like shell instance open. It's just like a socket established, and they're just like sending the data over each other for right now. Does everyone have two netcat sessions connected to each other? What's up?
So, like, is there any way to, like, beat your system when you, like, hit somebody? So they kind of, like, connect back or, like, make an attempt to connect back to the
Yes, we will be getting to that in a little bit. So when we go back to our Netstat itself, you can see it says 4000 is still listening, but there is an established connection right here, and we can confirm that because this is still an active like session. Hi. Oh, hi. So depending on the arguments you're using with Netstat, we can get rid of the L argument, which is for listen, and just do TUPN. And you can see only the established connections now. And the ones that we care about right now is these two. And this makes sense why it's set up this way. You see there's port 4000 and there's port 56,822. And the reason why this is like very like not really odd, it's just normal networking like traffic or the standards specifically. We spawn the listener on port 4000 and then we connected to it through localhost. This is just the localhost IP address. And that made the established connection. And since we reached out to that listener, it just picked a random port that was not used at the moment. And that happened to be, this one, very high number. And you can see for these other ones down here, which not really applying at the moment, but you can see I'm connecting to this website on port 443, which is HTTPS. And it's using this random port, which I don't know what that port is. There just needs to be open ports for both sides. For example, a server is usually going to run on the most common ports, and as a client, it's just going to use any available ports above like 20, 30K, because there's like 65,000 plus ports available to use. So I'm just going to cancel that netcat listener, and since I canceled the connection on the client side, it will cancel it on the server side. That's only really unique with netcat itself. For SSH, that does not matter because it's always running in the background as a listener and supports multiple shells. So with what Abir said earlier about how you want to be persistent with kicking someone out, because like as we can see, we saw there was an established connection here, and we know that was malicious in this sense. And we saw earlier that there was just a listening connection on port 4000, and this could be any port because since we use sudo, we could see like the type of program name that was running. So for example, if we had like port 40,000 listening and instead it was Python, that's probably a Python backdoor, or even Java. Any language can be used for like reverse shell basically. And one way to like defend against that is firewalls. So we got something called UFW, which stands for uncomplicated firewall. Lovely name. And you could use sudo UFW status, and it will say it's inactive for right now, probably for most of you. If you're using a Raylog machine, it's going to probably say it's enabled. So the way we're going to actually, quote unquote, kick people out, or at least add a layer in defense for reverse shells, bind shells, etc., is we're going to add some rules with UFW. Does everyone have it installed? Does it not say command available? All right, cool. So UFW has like pretty simple rules in the beginning, and just to show you how easy like this is, there's a great website you guys might have used before called DigitalOcean, and you could literally just look up DigitalOcean UFW Ubuntu. Yep, restart. 1 second. It's yelling at me. There's only two things we really want to care about right now, because we just want a general firewall running, because all that's really running right now is usually like IP tables, which is kind of complicated for like a first-time user. That's why UFW exists, because it's uncomplicated, hence the name. So there's two things we can really just do, as you can see here. No, not this one. Is it big enough? All right, cool. So we're going to add some default rules, which will make it a lot secure, or a lot more secure with these like weird connections on like these random ports. So you want to use sudo UFW and make sure it's actually inactive right now. You don't want to like kick yourself out, because if you're doing a competition machine, you're SSH'd in, you do not want to enable the firewall while you're already having a session, because you will kick yourself out and you probably will need to revert it as well, which is not fun. So just make sure it's not running at the moment. So you can just do status again. And if it says it's enabled, you just do sudo UFW and just disable that. And you can see the message I got right there. So now we're going to add those default rules that we talked about. So just default. And we're going to deny any incoming traffic, basically on any ports. And basically what this really means is, if I have that listener on the machine that's listening in port 4000, like the netcat session, if something tries to reach out to it, it's going to deny it because of the firewall itself. So when we enter this, it says it is added to the default incoming policy. Change to deny. So anything that's directly incoming to it, it could even be like a ping scan. Like, it, you know, you're trying to ping to it, and it's like, how about no? What's up?
How does it differentiate between you receiving traffic like by loading a web page and someone trying to SSH in
So
on port 80?
when you're SSHing in, you usually want to have a rule that will allow SSH. So that's just creating like a firewall rule that says, hey, anything on port 22, for this example, just allow either direction. It's bidirectional. Now, for websites, you're sending just a GET request to that website on their HTTP server, and that's outgoing from your machine. So it's not going to block it when it's incoming, because you're the one that's established the connection first off. It wasn't the other way around.
So it's only like it'll deny unprompted connections to your machine?
Yeah. Anything that's coming to you that was not on your accord, it will block. And then we want to add another default rule, and we want to allow any outgoing traffic. So that means, you know, pinging this website, accessing my file server, you know, playing, you know, my video games, anything like that. So once you have that running, or when you add that profile, I'm going to spawn the Netcat listener again and have it running in the background. So to enable the firewall, we just do sudo ufw enable. But before you do that, if this was a remote machine, you want to do allow 22. This will allow port 22, which is the most common port for SSH servers, usually. And then now you could do sudo ufw enable. And you can see it's enabled and active. And if I just do status on it just to confirm, you can see the profiles I have for it. So there's two explicit rules that are here. Port 22 allowed from anywhere, and for v6, which is IPv6, different IP standard. You don't have to worry about it for right now, but you can see from either type of IP address, it's allowing the traffic from anywhere. So now, since this is running, I'm going to try to connect to it again. And it may work because this is localhost. Yeah. So since this is localhost for this scenario, the firewall is not protecting you against it entirely. But if I wanted to connect to it differently through Netcat, so let me respawn the listener. Want me to show you it again, the profile?
Yeah, I did it. Yeah, I ran the commands. It's just not showing up when I do sudo ufw status.
Okay.
So within another terminal, I want you guys to run like IPA, and this will show you like your network interfaces, and it will give you like the IP address that you want to connect to through Netcat. So in our case, it's going to be this 1921. Now, depending if you're using VMware or VirtualBox, your IP will probably be different. But right now, my VM is running in NAT mode, so it's just, you know, natted through my host machine. So I'm going to use this IP address. And try to connect to it through Netcat on the same port.
Yeah, it's a
Oh my lord. Damn it. Hey Vincent, can you show me why this is acting the way it is? It's still allowing the connection some from weird reason.
How's it going? How was your break? Played this game called Elden Ring over break. How was your Oh shit.
Have any ideas, Vincent?
Oh, I got like
Have any
30
ideas?
hours on it over break.
Bro, I just hit 100
Not yet? Alright. Alright.
I'm at 80.
So you guys can just stop your Netcat listener. We're going to change it up a little bit because since this is running locally, it's probably just going to be acting a little weird for right now.
Let's check if it's working. Yeah,
But actually, no, actually, never mind. Start the listener and go to your host machine and go to the terminal there. So in my case, I have the Netcat listener running in the virtual machine itself on port 4000. And I know the IP address of it right here. So I'm going to try to connect to that through my host machine, which has a different IP address, which should block it. So I can just use Netcat again.
You're listening though on which port in the top of box? Okay.
So I'm listening in port 4000. You can just make it really whatever you want, as long as it's over 1,000. Just for our scenario. Okay, yeah, that's working now. So let me make this bigger for you guys. Okay, so we know the listener is running on the virtual machine, and we tried to reach out to it through Netcat on my host machine. And as you can see right now, on the listener, it does not say connection received. And it doesn't even say that there's a prompt here as well. So anything I type, you can see it's not outputting it right here on the listener itself. And that's because of the firewall, because the firewall is running. And would you say you had? Which IP did you use?
How yours is, but like I put it with mine. So it's like 192.
Well,
168,
the reason it's working for him is he's on localhost. He's connecting to himself.
Are you using your host machine's terminal?
You use your host machine. No, this is the same VM.
Oh yeah, it's because his computer's already.
Yeah, it's Ubuntu. You have to
Yeah.
exit out of that and go to like Windows.
Yeah. I just have a special scenario. I'm using Ubuntu on my host machine itself. So it looks a little weird when there's two terminators when they're two different machines.
Netcat, what do they do? Because a lot of them probably don't have Netcat on their Windows box.
Windows, yeah. I don't think I
Would be the
Oh
Windows.
no, they're going to use SSH for this case.
Okay, yeah.
So-
try SSH.
Yeah, SSH.
So since you have the SSH, that's what we did with John. Since you have SSH installed on Windows automatically, not the server, and you have the server running on your Ubuntu box, try to SSH in
Yeah.
to your Ubuntu box. And you want to show them the command?
Yeah, I'll show you the command. So for this, it's just going to be, whoops. It's just going to be SSH. I'm going to make this bigger for you guys. And then it's going to be your username that you made for the VM itself. And then it's going to be the @ symbol, and it's going to be going to the address that you want to send it to. Which it can't be the address that starts with 127. So it would look like this for me. It's going to be different for you guys depending on your IP and your username. But this is the format. The command, the user, at this IP address or domain.
Yeah, you can do that in the CMD on this video. And when you do that, what happens?
Let's see.
It's letting you connect.
It's letting me connect, and the reason why is we specified the rule right here. We're saying allow from anywhere. Let's change that real quick. Sudo UFW deny. All right, let me just disable it real quick. So I'm just going to bring down the firewall. Oh my God, please stop lagging.
Don't let her take it down.
All right, I'm going to stop it, and then I'm going to deny 22 this time. Oh my Lord. Yep.
Do you-
Yeah, I need UFW. Oh, come on. Please.
It seems very laggy.
I don't know why. It's only for this one. All right. So I added a new rule. I'm denying port 22 on the virtual machine through UFW. So now when I do UFW, sudo UFW enable, I'll make this bigger for you guys.
You have to do sudo UFW enable after every change.
I just disabled it, so I'm just doing enable to bring it back up again. So now when I do sudo UFW status, we should see the explicit rule that changed. And you can see now the action is deny instead of allow. So now when I actually use my host machine to SSH to that VM, it should probably just kick me out. And you can see it's just hanging right here. It's not saying yes or no. Do you want to like make this transaction to like share your fingerprint with each other, basically?
Allow what? Deny or, I mean, allow outgoing or incoming?
For anyone's running the SSH command right now, it's just hanging for you guys, right? So you SSH'd in? Check your UFW. Is the allow rule still on? Sudo UFW status?
That is where this, disable your firewall.
Yeah. So disable it. Sudo UFW disable.
Disable, or did you find it? Did you make the text?
And then do sudo UFW deny 22, which means deny port 22.
No, try it. Okay, it works.
And now then you can enable it again. Sudo UFW enable. Now SSH to it and see if it works. Yeah, through your host machine, SSH to the VM. What's up? Here, let me come over to you. Do the status command for me now.
So it's allowing, and then I do SSH Ubuntu, whose name is Ubuntu, and then that's the IP for I did come in a little late, so maybe I missed like an install that you guys did. SSH?
Okay, so oh, actually that's probably the case for you, because if you check your directory, yeah, you don't have an SSHD config.
Oh,
So do sudo apt update. And do sudo apt install. Open SSH dash server. And then hit yes for that. So once that's running now, you should be able to access it through your host machine.
okay, so do I disable the current?
No, it's if you go back to your UFW and you just go up arrow, just up arrow a few times. Yeah. And you can see it's already allowing 22, which is the port SSH server
Yeah.
normally runs on. So if you go here, it shouldn't kick you out.
Here we go.
So you can type yes and type in your VM password. And see it worked. So now you can do exit. Just type out exit.
Okay, cool.
Now, I want you to do sudo UFW deny 22. And now try to SSH.
I should have just turned it off, right?
I don't think it matters. See how it's just hanging now?
Yeah, now it just hangs.
We're denying port 22 altogether.
Okay.
Have any questions so far?
I think there's like random rules that are built.
Yeah, like, you know, I
I
did
think the default rules are
Yeah, let me put this down.
allow incoming, or sorry, the other way around. Allow
1 second.
outgoing. So it just doesn't show you. And they have like random little
I'm
rules.
putting down the mic for a second.
Giant ass star.
Depends on the
It goes the full length of the.
Yeah, but like it's showing like the special rules that you're getting at non-default.
Yeah. Like you see, even now, this and your
It's healing though.
by the way,
Like,
show like
That's
59
gonna, bro, I gotta look like a badass right now.
for real, the star's gonna be crazy.
Ethan,
It doesn't show.
how much FPS does that rig get on Elden Ring?
This rig?
Yeah, that rig, yeah, it's
Oh,
got
dude,
RG,
I
it's got
haven't
RGB
I
and
haven't even
shit.
tried.
It gets all the
He'll need a
It's
fire
got like,
hydrant.
yeah,
It
it's
gets
red.
all the
I'll need a hose. I'll need a hose to go with it. Just cool it down.
Yeah, it's just red,
It's
bro. It's
literally
like,
on Google Chrome,
Fire-
and you
fire
can cook a meal on it.
I always say it's the microwave and laptop in
The eggs
one.
really, yeah, it has some eggs. You just gotta put
Yes.
the eggs on the computer.
That's why they're so expensive.
You know, if you put your PC in your freezer, you can actually get extra FPS in the frame.
Oh, word? All
Yeah, like my computer just like crashed after like an hour though, and I can't turn it on. I don't know what happened.
The GPU's crystallized, but it's
No.
gotta be working.
Yeah, bro, that's right.
I think it's the other ports.
The microwave and laptop in one. How's your guys' laptops been treating you?
Bad.
Bad?
Sick. I just got a great deal.
That's-
On
that's
I
pretty
just got a
standard.
great deal on a laptop.
How about you, Ed?
Pretty good, man, honestly.
Pretty good?
Yeah, just an average.
That was up to $50 of
Yeah.
binary
Well,
stuff.
it's something, it's just good. It's regular.
Yeah, mine like work when I try to run like 3 VMs.
Yeah.
It just kind of
How much RAM is that's probably
If it's 8 gigs, then
it's
you're
eight, yeah, it's
yeah.
8 is in there. Have a hard time.
Yeah.
That's good to be done on top.
where it was. I don't know.
What do you use to analyze a binary?
Yeah, I regret the gaming laptop. So I originally got this one freshman year because I was like gonna be on campus, and so I'm like, all right, I'll play games
You game on it?
Yeah.
I bet you never game on it.
Yes, so now I don't because I'm back home.
It's
So
like
it's
yeah,
that's
every
the-
time like and then it overheats too. Gaming
Yeah.
laptops is the problem. Like my friend has one, and he's like, oh, you know, like it just doesn't run as
All
fast
the
as it
and
used to.
plus all the components in the laptop save like 3050 or 3060. It's not the same as like 3060 in an actual PC. It's like component that it's like smaller, so you fucking obviously fit it.
Yeah.
It also annihilates the battery. Like even if you just have like a
Battery's
20
crazy.
His laptop lasts 2 hours. Bro.
Yeah, 2 hours on a good day. It's like an hour and 20 minutes usually.
Yeah, you know, that's the biggest problem. Like the battery power on gaming laptops is just.
Yes,
Like
literally.
this one lasts me probably like a good like 6, 7
Yeah,
hours.
same.
Crazy.
I can't imagine.
Well, literally, I'll have like Google Chrome open with 4 tabs and it'll be running at like 100 degrees Celsius. Like, yeah, it's like I don't even, or it'll be like,
That's what like about this laptop. It makes no noise, bro, and it just doesn't ever get hot. So it's like
Yeah. I mean, I'm a loud typer. I need to get a silent. No, but no, it's like you know, I type it like, or you know, like.
I like that sound.
Yeah, it is like I'll be like you
you need
know.
to make a laptop with like a super nice mechanical keyboard.
With a hate mechanical.
What?
No. Like literally, the best keyboards I've used are like $20 Logitech.
Oh, the memory. The memory.
Yeah, I know.
Like I tried it. I got like one of those Corsair mechanical keyboards. I'm not a very clean person, so it got disgusting after like a month.
Okay, that's on you.
No, but it's, my brother has one. It's still pretty like,
I mean,
He also built it.
yeah. You should try custom building yours.
All the switches inside.
a custom built mechanical keyboard. I didn't even know you could do that.
That's what.
You can make it linear. You can make it like membrane attached.
And like you could set up exactly how you want it to match like how like the keycaps is
Yeah.
the shape of the keycaps. There's like a bunch of different styles. There's like XDA, shape, files. Yeah, it's really all preference how like the person likes the keycaps to do it, and then how he wants the switches. But the switches are like when they actually type how it feels when it taps things down.
Resistant.
Yeah, and resistance.
You want me to tell you? Okay, look, so it has the box size here. It's biodegradable, right? And it doesn't have copies like binary. Okay.
I will say, it gets expensive real quick. Real with the amount of add-ons you can do and like the amount of customization.
If you lube it too, you can only
Yeah.
get like
So
lube.
It can be time consuming.
It's fun though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's cool.
I didn't know there was that
His
much
keyboard,
like a keyboard.
I freaking love his keyboard.
Mine's crazy.
it's nice, equal, whatever. So this is the part where you have to
Yeah.
whatever.
And Ethan, I'm gonna steal your keyboard.
Yeah, I'll bring it one day and I'll like say, look guys.
He looks around.
Can I take a look at that?
Oh, Ethan, I just lost your keyboard, man.
I don't know, bro. I got robbed,
It
bro.
got.
I saw it and it was gone.
Someone just came up to me and I'm sorry, Ethan.
He sends my life with the keyboard, bro.
Yeah.
You know, and like keyboard's pretty valuable, but like,
Yeah. That's them's the rules.
I don't make the rules even. I'm just a player.
Just the player in the game.
Player, bro.
Have you been playing Elden Ring, John?
No. I play strategy games and shit. The full break, just like chilling. I've been playing a ton of Battlefield. Yeah.
That's like the last one. I think 5 speed.
I haven't played a lot of new ones. Like I have a lot of friends that play like Battlefield. You know, but I prefer like strategy. You know, Age of Empires too. I play a ton of that. Civilization 5. I love Civilization. Good, yeah, it's nice. Yeah.
It kind of is strategy a little bit, bro.
Yeah,
A little bit is strategy.
Yeah, like all my friends
you
on
have to
Steam
go.
are just selling. One of my friends has been playing like the past 3 weeks.
I got pissed off the other day.
It's so easy to get pissed off. The dude with the fucking, what is it, the gravity slam one, and then this dude with the crazy stuff.
Bro, you're gonna see this
Some of these
dude
cheats.
at the top right where the city is, bro. The dude like in front of a doorway, he's guarding the doorway, bro.
Like a giant ass shield, or like.
Yeah, he's on his horse, bro, and it's terrible, bro. I was going crazy. I was getting mad.
Really, really good stuff. No, but Elden Ring is kind of like a mix of all different genres.
I've heard it, yeah, like kind of like Dark Souls.
Yeah.
Okay, I am back. Just helping some people.
Yeah.
Let me check the chat.
I really like, I don't know the word, like, I guess like, bears. Like, you know, I won't buy a game for like, I'll wait for it to go on sale.
I feel that.
I can't remember the
But
last
this
time
is
I
an
bought a game.
exception. Like, I usually
I
don't
make
buy it.
exceptions, yeah. I
Yeah.
make exceptions.
Elden Ring was
It's like a game that's like crazy hype. I'll make that exception.
Yeah.
Is everyone ready for what's next?
We are ready.
All right, cool.
Wife had her meeting on how to properly find a porn site.
Yeah.
That won't give me a root.
All right, so we're gonna change something.
Yeah, like, I don't know, I'm terrified to run like anything. What are we gonna change, Austin?
We're gonna change a lot, good sir. All right, guys. Hey, Wasim. You're a little loud there, sir. All right. So, how many of you guys are familiar with Python on like a very general scale? All right, cool. So, with Ubuntu, it comes with Python by default, and you just gotta do Python 3. And you can see we got the interpreter for it. We're gonna use Python to host something pretty cool for us. So if you want, you can go to like your home directory. So you could just do CD, and that's gonna put you there too. Or you could do CD tilde. It doesn't matter for our case, because it's gonna take you back home. And we're gonna be doing this on our VM itself. So now we're just gonna make a directory, make dir, and we're just gonna call it, you know, web. And we're gonna CD to that folder that we just made. And you can see we're now in web. So pwd, home, my user, then web. Everyone good so far? All right, cool. So now we're going to use Python. So Python 3, and they have an argument -m, and they have like modules. So I believe it's HTTP. Oh, please load. Oh my God. Is that going to work? Okay, cool. So we're going to use -m argument, and we're going to load this module. We're going to use this Python module within our command prompt. And it's going to be http.server. And you can see it says serving HTTP on 0000. That means any external IP address, basically, in our network right now on port 8000, because that's the port it specified by default. And we can confirm it's running by going to a different shell and going back to Netstat. And we can see right here, port 8000 is running Python 3. And this can go into the scenario we talked about earlier, where any language can be used for a backdoor, basically. and we can see Python 3 is running. But we don't know much about it. We just got the process ID and the program name itself. So if we really wanted to, we can use netcat on localhost, like netcat localhost and on port 8000. And I know I fixed it. And you can see nothing's exactly happening right here, and that's because of the firewall still. And that's a good thing. So if I actually go to the browser, I can actually access that IP address. So for you guys, it's going to be different, but
Wait, Austin, go back to
what's up?
the terminal with the netcat that you just connected to the Python server, and then you hit enter. Okay. When I did it, it looked like that, but then I like typed something, and it popped up the HTML for the Python server.
Okay. Is your UFW default deny incoming?
I think so. Keep going though. You're good. Keep going.
All right, cool. So if you guys have the profile that is default deny incoming, there's a reason why this is going to hang right now. It just doesn't do anything. I pressed enter, and it's just going to kill the connection because we don't know what's happening. So if we want, we can stop that netcat listener from earlier because we're not going to use it right now. And we're going to do sudo UFW and just disable for right now. That's going to bring down all those rules that we have. So now, if you go back to our browser, the one for your VM itself, you could just type localhost :8000. And you can see we actually got a page, and it says directory listening for /. This is the / directory for the web server itself, not / for the Linux file system. And just to prove that to you guys, you can see even these status codes right here. Say there was a GET request from localhost trying to get the web page and see file not found for the favicon and such, 404. So we're going to actually put like a test page here for fun. So we're going to Control-C to stop the Python server. And you can use your preferred text editor and just make an index.html. And then you could just put some real basic HTML. There's an H1 header. What's up?
What did you get there?
So I'm using Nano, but you can use Vim. It depends on what text editor you want to use. But I just did, for my example, I'll show you guys. I just Nano and then the file name. This is going to create a file called index.html. And then I'm just going to put some simple HTML, H1, hello, and then
You have to have the closing bracket after.
yeah, right here. Oh, please. Oh, my Lord. This is why I like, IntelliSense for stuff. That should be right. Right, John? All right. So this is a real basic HTML page. The most simple you can get. Just a header. And then we're going to do, if you're using Nano, you could just do Control-X, and then just press Y for save, and then save it. So after you do that, you can see that the file does exist right here on HTML. So what we can do now is we can go back to that Python one-liner. So we can spawn that listener again in the web directory where we created that same file. And if I refresh this, you can see hello. It's here. And since that was labeled as an index.html, it just immediately went there. But we can change it up a little bit. So let's say I don't want to restart the server every time I edit the files, just for fun. Let me just go back to my home directory and go to web. And then I could just copy this file and just name it like, I don't know, test.txt. So now when I refresh it, it's still going to say the same stuff because there's an index page. But if I do /test.txt, you can see that text file is there.
What was the command you ran
For what?
to copy the file?
I just did a CP for copy, the source file, and then like where you want it, which I'm putting it in the same directory as test.txt. This is just general like Linux command line right now. Anyone need anything? So since we have that listener, like that Python server serving, our web pages, our files right now, and let's say we're given a machine that is serving files that are like public or private keys of a user, or even like confidential text files, because those are, those aren't fun at all. So we're going to re-enable our firewall, and since we know there's not a rule that exists for port 8000, it should just deny the traffic for it. So if I go back to this, it's going to be cached in the browser, but if I go back, I don't know if this is going to be cached still. Oh, it's because this is localhost. One second. So when we have the firewall running, use your host machine's browser instead of your VMs this time.
What did you say?
Use your host machine's browser. Should be like. So if you don't know the IP address, if you forgot it, you can just run IP again or ifconfig, and then I'm just going to pop this in the browser on my host machine. I'm going to get rid of that /24, and since this is running on a different port, we got to do :8000. And you can see it just says it's loading right now. And that's because the firewall is blocking our attempt for this page. And just to confirm that it is the firewall doing that for us, we could just disable the firewall again. And run it on port 8000, and you can see the page is served. Just because of us enabling our firewall and adding default rules is just one of the greatest things for like the network side of defense for BlueTeam. So any VM you're given, check if the firewall is enabled, and if you have required services that need to run on it. So for example, all the competitions we have done in the past like 2 semesters, these VMs had like a database running, a web page running, even some obscure like command and like control thing that's running, for example, like Jenkins for like development purposes. You need to check out what ports those are actually running on Netstat. So when you create the firewall, not create, but enable it, you want to make sure those ports are allowed, because a lot of these competitions, they're scored based off of how long your services are active and up. So you don't want to screw yourself on some points by your firewall taking it on your service externally. Anyone have any questions so far? Let's go back. And you can see this IP address now access the web page. It's no longer the 1271, which is localhost. My host machine, you can see it logged the access for itself.
So the Python 3 little one line right there logs all connections. Is that right?
No. So to just state what Ethan said, we're just using a Python 3 module called http.server, which just runs on the default port of 8000. And it's just a module that is made by like either the Python developers or some sort of just contributors, where they were like, hey, instead of us making, hand coding a HTTP server every single time, let's just make it a module. Because when you're blue teaming and red teaming, it's very useful to just be able to spawn an HTTP server and then use a target machine and grab a file from that. Because, for example, let's say someone's firewall was configured properly and they were allowing like every outgoing connection. So they could say, hey, let's use this web server and grab this file, which is actually just a PHP web shell. Which I don't know if you might have covered that a little bit in the CTF meetings. But overall, just having those 3 default rules from DigitalOcean, the default deny incoming and outgoing, that's one way to prevent weird bind shells, reverse shells, even weird programs that are running in the background that have some sort of like established connection or listening connection established. And I recommend, I'm probably going to put this in the Discord, in our meetings chat, this link, because it's just really great. DigitalOcean is honestly a great like tutorial site for like setting up like your own like little server. That's why they exist, because they have like their droplets, which are basically just little VPSs, virtual private servers and stuff. That's in the cloud. I highly recommend, if you guys have like $5 to spare a month, have a VPS, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can make it a VPN. You can make your own website on it. You can do whatever you want, just for like just a few dollars a month. Highly recommend it. It's one of the best skills, especially that's honestly, and that makes you do real blue teaming. Because if I go to my my logs on this machine, my host machine, you could do it in your VMs if you want. So user var log. So if I go to this directory /var/log, this is what like holds. Oh God, let me fix that. Oh my lord, that's a lot of logs. 1 second. Let's not use yeah, that's better. Oh my god. That's hectic. All right, so ignore all the red. These are just backup logs, but the ones we're going to care about for right now is like your auth logs. And this is what I was talking about earlier with like bots brute forcing SSH. So if we just use like the tail command, which will show us like the last few lines of a file, and we could do auth.log. And you can see that there was like open and closed sessions. And like there's my user executing commands and such for authentication. So if I actually want to open that file, I can use something called less, which will allow me to just use my arrow keys to navigate the file. So I do auth.log. And you can see I can use the arrow keys to go all the way through it. So in this scenario, it doesn't look like I have any like bots trying to ding my SSH server, but on anything that's external to like the public internet, and you check the same file, you will see bots like every single second try to get your root path, like try to root login every second.
When?
Like any second.
All the time?
Like all the time. Like people make bots to scan the entire internet, like the entire IPv4 address space, and they're like, let's just see what machines we can get. And that's often how botnets are created. You have a weak root password. They log in, and then they install some tools where they're now using your machine and orchestrate their attack for like DDoSing or whatever. And that's kind of like why we said earlier for that SSH config, disable permit root login. You don't want that one bit, because you don't want to be a part of a DDoS scheme, I guess. Any questions so far? Because that's really all I had to cover. I can show you more of the PowerPoint. It was just kind of more general stuff. It was very hands-on. So we kind of said everything was like a file. And I'll kind of go over this again just to be sure. So we got /etc holds your configs for basically everything. Got /home typically for your users and everything. Then we got like user and var, depending on what they're used. They could be used for like storing certain program, not configs, but certain like logs for certain things. For example, /var. We got temporary directory, which can be used for like really anything you wanted to do. Typically, when you're red teaming, the temporary directory can be has like read and write access. So let's say you're trying to like escalate your privileges, maybe run a script. You would run it in /temp. That's like the red teaming aspect of it. And you got /bin, which is where all your like binary files are. For example, copy, file, cd. Those are all like commands that are been compiled that run on your like machine. And the other thing we're talking about earlier was with systemctl and like the services. And we were talking about the /etc sshd config, which the D is like for daemon or daemon, however you want to pronounce it, where we change the permit root login. That's the most important thing to probably change first off when you get access to the machine. And this is just a little diagram to show like systemctl or systemd and how everything is like a service and everything is like a file. So like SSH would have its own service, or have it like it would create its own sockets. It's just a very broad diagram at the moment. And then we kind of mentioned about UFW, about how make sure it's enabled. They prevent any unwanted shells from spawning on any obscure ports. And we can use these following options, which we used earlier: the default deny incoming, default allow outgoing, and allow SSH. You never want to forget that, especially when you're working on it remotely. Never. You will lock yourself out. And just make sure you enable it at the very end. And then we talked about using Netstat for finding any listening connections on a machine. And I haven't really talked about these two, but I could show them real quick. This is more of like the task manager version of Linux. So if I go back to my VM, you're going to have to install this with apt install. So I'm going to run htop, but just for anyone who doesn't have it, you want to do sudo apt install htop. It's a very pretty version of top, which is one that already comes with Ubuntu. So once you have that, you have a task manager. You can see like the amount of threads you have on your machine, the memory, even like the swap partition and stuff. And you can see all these processes that are running right now. So if you guys remember, if I start a Netcat listener on any port really, and go back to htop, I can press F3 for my search, and then I can type NC. And that's probably going to be a little too vague, so I'm going to do F4 for filter NC. And you can see right there on the very bottom, you can see that my user has ran this command. And we see that within htop. And we can kill it the same way as we did before. But instead of using like the kill command, we can use htop's way of doing it, which you could just do F9 when you're hovered over it, and then you could just do like the number 9 option, sig kill. So now, you can see right here, it says actually killed within the terminal for our Netcat. So that's one way to kick someone out of a session that you know is unwanted. For example, if I went to SSH, filter by SSH, you can see that there's actually no like connections running right now. We just have the root user that has like the listener set up, the service itself, and then we just have an agent running for right now off of my user. But for example, if I wanted to SSH to myself, which you guys can as well, through your own local machine, and I'm just going to type localhost because this is within the same command prompt as the VM. I'll say yes, and then type in my password. And you can see right here, whoops, that I'm SSH'd into the VM on the VM. You know, we're just making up, you know, boxes and boxes type of deal right now. But if we go back to htop while that SSH server session is open, you can see right here, SSHD, my user at PTS3, which is just like a terminal session. So, for example, during CCDC, there was always this one user that would keep logging in on my machine, and I didn't know what exploit they were using. But every time I would just see root at whatever, their IP address, and I would just have to just keep killing the session and kicking them out every single time. Even though the firewall is on, you just have to do many layers in defense. What's up?
What did you sort to see the SSH session?
Yeah, so after you run htop, you can click on F4, or you can press F4 on your keyboard, and then you could just type SSH out. This will just show what is within what you typed out. Now you can even see, like, we got SSH at localhost, and we got this. So the daemon is the session that's actually running on the server itself, and then we got this SSH command that is, quote unquote, us reaching out to somewhere else. But in our scenario, we're just SSH to the same machine we're actually on. Does that make sense for everyone? Because the networking for some of this stuff can be a little complicated when you're pretty new at this stuff, but you will get the hang of it really quickly. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. And then we could do PSAUX, which is something that is very similar to htop, but it's not as interactive. I'm not too much of a fan of it. So if I go to my PUAUX, you can see this isn't as pretty, and it just pulled like what is actually running. So if I want to see what's running, I would have to pipe that output and grep for SSH. And you can see right there, actually, no, I don't want to do it here. I want to do it in the VM. My bad. PSAUX, PS stands for process, and then grep for SSH. And you can see we have the same output as HTOP. We got at the terminal session at the local host. It's the same stuff, but HTOP is a lot more interactive because you get to see stuff that's actively spawning and turning on, turning off, compared to PS is just saying, here, let me just take a snapshot of what's active and just display it. What's up? So we're piping the output of this. So if I just run PUAUX, it shows me everything. So grep is a way to filter the text. So we're piping the output, which means take all the output from the previous command, and we're using grep, and we want to look for SSH. And if you're really specific, you could use -I argument, which means ignore case, which means it will ignore if it's lowercase or capital. It will just be whatever this is, upper or lower. And you can see it highlights everything for us too, which is very useful. So let's say you didn't have root access to a machine when you're trying to harden it, but they do have PS enabled. You can grep for it. What's up, Abir?
How do you like ban an IP? Say you want to like make sure like your service is active, but you want to ban specific IPs that's trying to exploit your machine.
Yeah. So you can do that through UFW, and the DigitalOcean guide actually shows that. So if we go to right here, yeah, specific IP addresses. Let me make this bigger. So let's say you have a server like in the cloud, Azure, AWS, whatever, and you know it has a static IP address. And let's say you only want to allow certain services connecting to it. You can do a sudo UFW allow from this IP address. So for example, this IP address in this scenario could be, USF's network or your own home's public IP address. And that will ensure that only you have SSH access to that machine. So that's one way you can ban IP addresses. But you can also do the same stuff. You could do sudo UFW deny from this IP address. So that's one way to quote unquote ban an IP space. Any questions? Did everyone feel like they learned something today?
Yes, sir.
What's up?
So in a CTF, like one of these like BlueTeam CTF, are we gonna be allowed to like ban an IP?
They usually give you rules on what you can do. So for example, there's a very popular tool called like fail to ban for SSH, which basically just means, hey, if this IP address makes like 10 plus SSH connections that are all invalid in like a span of like a minute, it will block the IP address for you already. And usually those are not allowed during BlueTeam competitions, but in like corporate environments they are, typically.
Everything's allowed in corporate environments. There's nothing
But
disallowed.
like you said, so even the like on cyber games, we have to like up our services, but we still have to keep those like malicious activities. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could have done this.
Yeah, you can use, that's why I'm really teaching it for us today, is for any upcoming competitions. UFW is super easy to learn, because compared to like, you could just read it like, it's like pseudocode basically. Oh wow, we're allowing this port to this port with this protocol. Compared to, IP tables, which is kind of a mess. Example. So you have this command for IP tables, which for learning it new, you might mess up the syntax and everything, but you can still see like the type of rules that are in place, like the input rules and the output rules. But UFW is basically orchestrating like your IP tables in the background without you. And that's why you can see in the very beginning of like the DigitalOcean blog, it should talk about it. Yeah, see, it's an interface to IP tables itself, but it's made for just making it simpler for like basically everyone. Because UFW is super strong, and I absolutely love it. And when you're using a client-based firewall, this is probably one of the best ones to use on like any like Linux distribution. So I recommend getting good with it and researching with it as well. If anyone doesn't have any more questions, we could just wrap it up. You all good? I could do the QR code, yeah.
Can you have USF network really quick?
So for anyone that didn't scan the QR code, go for it. Everyone good? Perfect. All right. Well, goodbye, guys.
Thank you all.